Now let's look at the PESTEL model, which is a model to understand the macro environment, to understand changes in the macro environment. The macro environment could be understood as comprising of the political environment, the economic environment, the legal environment, the social environment, the environment of the environment of the scientific environment, and the technological environment. Now, let's look at each one of these areas to see how they impinge on strategy. We'll start with the political environment. There are several initiatives that are launched by different governments at different points in time. Each of these initiatives has an impact on strategy, on the strategy of the company. Let's take some examples. Let's look at deregulation, which is an initiative which the government which governed India in the early 90s. Deregulation was a move which was brought in by the government of that time in the early 90s, what we call the liberalization movement. Now, during liberalization, what happened was that licensing of industries was removed, and it was possible now for anyone to set up a company, to set up an industry without waiting for licenses from the government. This was different from the earlier practice. Now, the immediate impact of this when it came to the cotton yarn industry was that a large number of spinning mills were set up within a short period of time. And what happened was that because of this excess supply of cotton yarn, supply was very much more than demand. There was a crash in prices, and the cotton yarn industry suffered financially for 2 or 3 years till demand picked up again and supply and demand matched. So, deregulation had a particular impact on the cotton yarn industry. Deregulation is a political move of a government, and that impacted the cotton yarn industry. It impacted the strategy formulation of the cotton yarn industry. Let's look at another example. Regional integration. Regional integration, that is integration in the area, in the region of South Asia. Now, there is the South Asia Regional Cooperation Movement. This movement was given strength, was given prominence by a government during the early 2000s. Now, at that point of time, the cotton textile industry, right? Not merely, earlier we were talking about the cotton yarn alone, but here we are talking about the cotton textile industry, which is the yarn, fabric, garments, right? Now, if we look at garments, for instance, what happens is that garment making in India is much more expensive than garment making in Bangladesh, right? Now, once regional integration took place, garments from Bangladesh started competing with garments from India. Garments, what we wear, clothes that we wear. So, here is an instance of how a political action, which is regional integration, impacted a industry and how the strategy of that industry was affected. Right. Now let's look at economic factors. Right. When we talk about economic factors, we are talking about things like the growth rate of the economy. The growth rate of the economy impacts industry. It impacts strategy making in the industry. To take an example, if you have a industry like the bicycle industry, right? Now the bicycle industry today is a mature industry in India. It's not a rapidly growing industry. So normally one would expect that there is price war in that industry, right? Because the industry is not growing. However, this price war does not take place when the growth rate of the economy is high and people who in the rural areas, for instance, continue to buy bicycles. So growth rate of the economy impacts industry strategy. Then let's look at the interest rate. Right? Interest rate is another very important variable as far as the economic policy, as far as the economic environment is concerned. When the interest rates are high, what happens to the building industry? What happens to the housing industry? The housing industry is adversely affected. When the interest rates are high, people do not take loans to buy houses, and hence people buy less houses, and hence the building industry is affected. So here is an instance of an economic event, interest rate affecting industry. Let's now look at the exchange rate. The exchange rate is an equally important parameter in the economic space. A very interesting impact of the exchange rate is on the price of petrol in our Indian domestic market. Now, as you are aware, India imports most of its crude from overseas. The prices of crude, even when they came down 2 years back, the price of petrol in India did not come down, but it went up. Why is that? If the price of crude internationally is going down, one would expect that the price of petrol in India also goes down. But because the rupee declined vis-a-vis the dollar, that had an impact on the rupee price of petrol in India. Yes, the dollar price internationally came down, but the rupee price in India went up. So this is an impact of how exchange rate can affect an industry. Let's look at the final criteria, one of the final indices of economic activity, and that is inflation. Right? What happens when there is inflation? When we live in an inflationary environment, it is difficult to predict the price of commodities. Because it is difficult to predict the price of commodities, economic decisions are put on hold. People do not take economic decisions. They would rather wait to see what happens in the economic environment before they take a decision. So inflation increases uncertainty in the economy. What we have seen now is how the economic environment, how factors in the economic environment impact industry and hence impact strategy formulation in industry.